Should you rent or should you buy? Man, that is such a good question, and it's one that I get all the time, and I'm confronted with even in myself in my own personal life. Like, is it the better deal to rent or is it the better deal to buy? And so let's talk about that a little bit. Hey, but before we get underway, just wanted to say thanks for listening today, and we'd love to have you guys subscribe to the channel, join our newsletter, and follow us in our social media. So if you haven't done that yet, take a moment, knock that out. We'd love to get you joining and being part of the team here on Wealth for Doctors. The question here is just like, what are the numbers? Because at the end of the day, if the numbers are favorable, it starts to become a clear decision one way or the other. It could be very clear that renting is the better arrangement if the numbers, paint that picture. Could be very clear that owning is the better arrangement if the numbers kind of suggest that. So the question here is, what do the numbers have to say? And so this, what I'm implying by that is that it's a case by case scenario, case by case analysis. Like, we can provide some rules of thumb, but to really do this justice, I think you just have to analyze and run the numbers every time to make that determination, make that decision. But generally speaking, if you are looking to use something for a long time, and long time is, it's not very clear, but what it tends to be is, what I mean by that is a long time. Something like, let's say it's a home purchase. We're talking 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, maybe longer. Then home ownership or buying is going to be the better way to go. But if it's going to be, short-term usage or a one-off usage or just one time, not regular or frequent or maybe never again, then renting tends to be the better solution. Yeah, just rent it. In fact, there are times that I just love renting. It's awesome. Like, I just go to the store. Let's say I need to buy or use a tool. It's only a tool that I expect to use one time. I'll rent it, and I pay a relatively small price in comparison to the overall cost of the tool, get all the benefits of that tool, but then I don't have to keep that tool. I can send it back to the store and they get to have it and they rent it off to somebody else. But I pay usually a fraction of the homeowner or the cost, the ownership cost. And now I don't have to have it. I don't have to have any maintenance or operation or oversight or storage or inventory, and some of these notions that come with ownership. So let's talk. Like, what do you get when you rent? When you rent, you get the full acquisition of this item for the time that you are renting it. In some ways, it's as if you own it for the time that it has been rented. Of course, there's not complete ownership here because you do have to give it back, and usually there's requirements and stipulations regarding damage and the like. But the point being is you can do with it pretty much the same as if it was yours. And so you get, the full benefit right out of the bat. Plus, it tends to be at a much lower price, sometimes, many times, considerably lower price than actually owning it. So it's less cost. Like, you get the full benefit of owning something without actually owning it. So, and paying the cost more so of owning it. But then, part of that cost is not just the purchase price of the item in question. It's the maintenance, it's the operation, it's the headache, it's the hassle. What if we got tools, we got to have storage for those tools, or maybe we have to keep maintaining those tools. If you've got like a lawnmower or something, you gotta go and fill the gas tank and change the oil and clean it, and sharpen the blades or whatever you would do for the item. Like, you're responsible for it, so care for it as you will. So if you have a house, you're responsible for the house. If something breaks, a window breaks, you need to cover that. And then usually you have insurance and other things that have to come into play that are also part of the cost and the calculation. So you don't have any of those requirements, any of those issues in rental. You've rented it, you get to use it, it's there, you get those benefits, and now it's right back to the person who owns it. So, like, in a short-term arrangement, like, renting is great. Like, why not rent? Like, why would you buy? And I'm not just talking like the question of buy versus rent for homes. I'm talking even just like sometimes everyday tools or vehicles. I mean, there are things where we have a natural tendency, I think, too much to feel like we need to buy. I need to buy this. And I don't see that as the right solution. Like, it's renting strategically can be a really smart use of your money. But why do people have issues with renting? Why do they like, no, you got to buy? Like, why is buying, seen as the better alternative, and can for sure be the better alternative? Why? It's because it feels like you're just losing money when you're renting. Like, oh, I paid 25 or $50 to go and rent that tool out today, and if I had just paid maybe $150, I would have it, and then I'd always have it, and I would never have to rent it again. And so it's like, I'm a third of the way in there, and like I'm not getting any of that money back. And it's like some of the wrongheadedness in that thinking is like people are like, well, I'm not getting any of that money back. It's like, well, you got a chance to use the item in question. Like you got benefit here. Just because you don't own it at the end of the day doesn't mean like you didn't benefit from this deal. Like you got to use whatever you rented, so like that's a win. Like you did get something in exchange here. So there can be a wrongheaded thinking where people tend to think that I need to own, because if I don't own, I am losing money. Like I'm always losing money on renting. And if you feel that way, you're just wrong. You're not factoring in the fact that you are actually receiving value or benefit from the rental, from whatever it is that you're renting. And so renting is not just throwing or losing money. Like that's just not true. It's almost completely wrong if you think that way. But there are times where renting, especially in the long term, is more expensive, and so you're better off. You're better off owning. Like you'll make more money. You will come out ahead if you own. But that payoff, where we see that break even and that change, where the tipping of the scales, so to say, is in your favor, uh, takes place over the course of time. It doesn't happen usually immediately, and it's usually not with just a couple, uses. If we're thinking of tools, it's not just a couple times of renting. I mean, it would be ongoing, regular, consistent usage. Then, yeah, buying is better than renting. And so, speaking to your home, which is probably the most common example people think of when they're talking about renting versus buying, is that it's that scenario that I was laying out a moment ago. If you're going to be in the property or in this location for 5 to 7 years, or longer, it does tend, it's not always, you really actually have to run the numbers. There are places, even where the rent is high, it's still better to rent because the cost of homeownership is just so stinking more. There are times where, homeownership is the better option. It can go either way. So even in a long term, my point being, even in a long term though arrangement, renting can still win in some situations or scenarios. What are some of the costs to be thinking about specifically with homeownership, and why that is maybe an expense you're not really factoring? Because people tend to think like, oh, I'm winning. I'm winning if I have my own place and I'm paying on my mortgage, and I'm paying down some of that loan, and so I'm more of that money, even though it's a payment that I'm making, more of that money is staying behind in my pocket. It depends on a lot of things, but the truth is, it's not as much that money probably is staying behind in your pocket as you think is staying behind. You do have, the cost of the loan, the financing of that. So only so much of that payment is actually going towards principal pay down, building your equity. A good portion of that payment, again, depends on how the loan's structured, but a good portion of that payment is probably just going towards interest, which is a cost to you anyhow. And it could be, advantageous for a tax deduction, but how much of a benefit that tax deduction is really specific to your situation. And a lot of times there's not any tax benefit to that interest. So it's not like that's saving you any money either. Plus, you're picking up the property taxes on the property, and then you have a homeowner's insurance on the property. And then the risk that if something does happen to the property, even with homeowner's insurance, you've got the deductible on the property. And then maybe the possibility that even that homeowner's insurance policy doesn't cover things fully, and you still have to come out of pocket to make yourself whole if some sort of damages take place. And there's no number of things that could potentially cause damages to your property. And so there's quite a bit of risk actually you take on that in owning this thing. If this goes sideways on you might end up losing money, not making money. So I mean, you just have those fixed, ongoing costs of property taxes, interest, and insurance that are there. But there's also, the utilities, which you may or may not cover in a rent versus homeownership arrangement. Could be in play, but maybe you're responsible still for the utilities, depending on the situation. Could have HOA fees or dues. Could be responsible for specials, as they call them, with property taxes, where if they make any improvements out on the street, or sidewalks, related to the city, you have to cover those because someone has to be building paying for improvements on the streets, all of that falls on you. Plus, there's a tendency to want to fix up your property. And so, now that it's yours and you're not renting it, like if you're living in a rental, like you have no real strong desire to go and fix it up. It's like, why would I fix up someone else's place? Like, I'm not getting any benefit out of that. But people just love the idea of fixing up their own place. Like, well, you may not make any money back on all that fixing up that you're doing. Perhaps at best, you're probably just getting your money back. You could be overpaying, doing too much for a house, and just it doesn't come back home to you when you go to sell it. But we have this tendency or desire to keep wanting to improve our homes, especially if we own them. And, it gets to be really just a source of consumerism, of spending. And so, you have that where you don't really have it with a rental. I think maybe the last consideration here too is that there isn't as much flexibility. Now, I mean, there's good and bad with that. The flexibility on the rental side is that, potentially your landlord could hike up the rates or kick you out, or you get evicted, or any number of things. Of course, there's, agreements and things to protect you there, but, it may not work for you. It works for you today in the rental, but maybe next year it doesn't work for you any longer. Like things can change. Or you just, you have a landlord who's just a pain and you don't like them one little bit, and yet they're your landlord and you have to deal with them. And so there's definitely that issue with a rental. But on the homeownership side, the thing is it's expensive to move real estate, between putting it on a market and trying to get it to be sold, and usually the commissions that you pay out to realtors. Like, it's an expensive transaction. And so, especially because it's expensive, like, if you only have like a couple of years in which you live at a house, like the break even on this, folks, is probably at least 5 years. And that's just the break even. That's not you actually making money on that whole rent versus buy decision. Uh, if you buy a house and only live in it for 3 years, you probably would have been better off renting altogether. So my point being on the rental question here is that there's flexibility. One of the benefits of it, I mean, that flexibility may work against you as a tenant, but it could work for you that, hey, like, we decided to change jobs or go to another location, or we don't like this neighborhood, or maybe our neighbors came in and we don't like them any longer. There's any number of changes that could take place if it gives you the freedom in a rental arrangement to just be like, oh, well, let's just change. We'll move. And, moving is not the best thing, but you tend to live in smaller places when you rent. And so you don't have as much to move. And so, there's a little bit more freedom, if you will, in a rental situation than you have with a home ownership situation. Not to mention that when you go to sell your house in a home ownership situation, you really get to find out what that house is worth. And there are times where you have your ideas of what you think your home is worth and things that you want it to be, but then you have to come with the market realities. That has its own source of stress and concern and worry. Only you don't really pick up on, I don't think, as much in the rental. So the truth is like, owning a house in particular, but just owning anything, is not inherently better than renting it. And if you think that renting is just throwing your money away, you're mistaken. That's the wrong approach, wrong attitude. You are getting something in exchange for that rental arrangement. And you need to value that, like, hey, I got to use or do this that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, or would have cost me a lot more money if it wasn't for this rental opportunity. And so renting, like, given the right conditions, I would be fine to rent everything. Now, I don't think realistically you can pull that off and make that happen, but given the right conditions, I would be just fine renting rather than owning. That is not necessarily the case. So if you want to run the numbers on this and get a better sense of, like, gosh, okay, it can be a complicated question. Hey, that's one of the reasons why you would maybe hire us out. We'd love to go and work with you and walk through those numbers and think through these considerations and just make sure that you're making the best decision possible here. But there is a calculator, especially put out by the New York Times. There's lots of calculators, but New York Times, I feel, has the best calculator, in my opinion. And so you can do this, should I rent or buy home calculation, run through all the different inputs that come into that decision, and they can, play it out to you, as to which way, depending on the amount of what you're paying in rent, when it would work in your favor, one side or the other. And so, quite frankly, that's what I use when I go to run the numbers on this and try to decide, is I go to that calculator. So I hope you guys found this super valuable and awesome. That's what we're striving for. So please, again, subscribe to the channel, follow us on our social media, sign up for our newsletter, and continue to stay tuned. We're going to keep delivering awesome content. Thanks.